Hey guys, Brian here, and welcome to another coding tutorial. This is the second tutorial in our series where we're going to be building a Node Express application. And in the first application, we basically set up our environment. We installed everything we needed to and created the directory structure for our project. And here I am inside of VS Code, my editor of choice, and we're going to be actually working with some code now. But first things first, what we want to do is actually install the Node module for Express itself. And we can do that right with inside VS Code. So VS Code's great because it's got a built-in terminal, and you can open up that terminal with Control backtick. That's the key to the left of number 1 in your row of number keys. And so once that terminal's up, we actually can just go ahead and we're in the directory where our project is. So we can just type npm install Express. And that's as easy as it is to install the npm module Express into our project. And as you can see on the left here, we've got this folder called Node Modules that has a listing of all of the modules that were installed from installing the Express package. Express depends upon a lot of modules, so that's why there's a lot of entries inside of here. Now, a little bit more about Express itself. Express is the actual web server that's going to be run on our computer and handling all the requests and processing the logic. And it'll make a bit more sense once we actually start writing some code and see what Express does for us. So let's close out the terminal again by hitting Control backtick, and we're going to open up a new file with Command N in VS Code, and we're going to hit Command S to save the file, and we can save this file as app.js. So the first thing we want to do here is actually bring in the Express module into our application, into this specific script. And we can do that with a simple node require statement. And so what that's saying is basically we want to load in the Express module into this Express variable that we've got. And from there, this variable gives us access to everything that the module offers us. And in this case, what we want to do is actually create an Express application by calling what we imported from the Express module as a function. And you'll see as we go forward, this app variable is how we set up our application and is used for everything that we want to configure it with. So the two things that we want to start off with is creating a test route within our application just to be able to test things out and see if it's actually working properly, and have the application start listening on a local port. So let's start with setting up the test route. So we can do that in this case with the app.get function. And I'll write this out here and I'll go over what's going on. So Express has functions that can specify what type of HTTP request it should be listening to. So you can say app.get, app.post, delete, put, and a whole slew of other lesser used ones, and define what route the application should be listening to that request on. And in this case, what we said is we want to listen on the base route, just /, which means that once you hit your local host on the port that the server is listening to, without providing any path at all, this is the default route that'll get hit as long as a GET request is sent to the server. The second parameter that's provided in this function is a callback. And what's provided to this callback function by Express is both a request and a response object. The request object contains information, as you guessed, about the request. So things that are sent from the client, such as the parameters of their request, any of the body that was sent in the request, anything like that. And the response object is used for a couple things, but mainly just for setting up what data you want to return to the client. And in this case, we're just going to keep things really simple. On the request object, we have a JSON function that we can actually just go ahead and very easily send JSON data back to the client. So in this case, we're just sending back JSON that is a simple JSON object with a message of hello world. And what this will do is once the server sees a request to the base route, if it's a GET request, this function here will be executed. And what's this function doing? Just one thing, it's just returning back some JSON to the client. And you'll see how this works, and it'll make a lot more sense in just a second. Now, the next thing we want to do is actually have the application listen on our local host. So right now, it's not really doing anything. It's not listening on anything. It's not set up. And luckily for us, we can do that very easily with the listen call on the app variable that we set up. So like I said, you're using this app variable for everything you want to do to set up your server. So in this case, we're setting up the route here, and then we're telling the application to actually listen on port 3000, and this will listen on our local host. So let's see how things actually work. Let's open up our integrated terminal again. Remember, control backtick. And we're going to use our NodeMon program that we installed in the first tutorial. Now, if you recall, NodeMon actually looks at your code and watches it to see when you make a change. And once you do, it's going to reload the script that you tell it to load. So in this case, all we have to do is say NodeMon app.js. And what it's going to be doing is actually watching any of the files inside of this directory to see if there's any changes to your code. And if there are changes, then it's going to reload your application. So if you'll notice, what happens if we go in here and we want to listen to port 3333 instead? Once we save this file and watch the terminal down below, the terminal you can see restarted due to changes. So every time you make a change to your code, NodeMon is automatically going to restart your server. And that's great because it saves us time. We don't have to restart our server manually every time. Now, our server is now listening on port 3333. So let's go to a browser and see what actually happens when we hit that point. So if we go to our browser and we say we want to go to the local host on port 3333, you'll notice we use a colon here to specify that we want to go to port 3333 on localhost. And localhost is just a nicer way of saying IP address 1.2.0.0.1, which just means that it's your local computer. You're not going to another external server. You're trying to connect to your local computer. And remember, we've got that Node Express application listening on port 3333. And we set up that test route, right? So when we go to path / or just the default path without anything provided, we're getting back this JSON, right? This message, hello world. So we have everything wired together. We set up our Node application, we set up a test route, and we actually had our application listening on a port on a local host. And we can see already the fruits of our labor coming through with being able to go to a browser, go to our application's port that it's listening on, and see the data actually coming back. So that's great. Now, let's add a couple things to just spruce things up a little bit and make things a little bit nicer within our application. So coming back to VS Code, and I'm going to close the integrated terminal. Well, actually, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to stop the server, stop NodeMon from running with Control-C, and that just kills the process. We're going to install another Node module, and this time it's going to be one called Chalk. And if you'll notice, I'm just using the letter I instead of install. It's the same thing, it just makes it quicker to type. npm I Chalk. And Chalk is a module that lets you write to the console with some nice colors, and you can use foreground colors and background colors. It just makes it nicer to look at and makes some things more distinguishable from the rest of the text and kind of easier to follow along. So let's start back up our NodeMon process, and I'm going to just hit the up arrow to cycle through the commands I just issued, and hit enter to start NodeMon. And coming back to the code here, what we're going to do is import our Chalk module, right? Same way we did with Express. Now, the first thing we're going to modify is our app.listen call. And the listen function has actually got another function signature that we can use, which actually has a callback passed as the second parameter that'll be called once our application actually starts listening. So let's just have a simple console log statement saying listening on port. And then we're going to call the Chalk module and say chalk.cyan 3000. And in this case, let's change it to 3333, since that's the one we're actually listening on. Now, all this is doing is saying that we want to console log this string, and remember, inside your console log statements, you can separate any number of parameters inside this call with commas. You can pass in any number of parameters, and the console log function is going to take in all of those and print them out all in one line. And this is the way you use the Chalk module. You call chalk dot whatever color you want, and the Chalk API documentation has a listing of all that stuff, and you can actually color your text that way. In this case, we're just writing the number 3333 in the color cyan. So if we come back to our integrated terminal, you can see that our message is now being outputted properly, listening on port 3333, and it's in the color that we expect it to be. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to see if there's an error with our server. If anything goes wrong with starting up the server, we want to know about it. So let's come back into our code, and we're going to do this first, where we're going to actually get the return of this app.listen call, which is going to be the server that's actually listening. And what is provided on this object here is the .on function. And what we can say here is we can define the type of event that we want to listen for, in this case an error, and define the function that we want to be called if an error happens. In this case, we want to console log that in our chalk.red color that an error has happened. And we can print out that error that has happened. And let's actually make that so the error won't be colored red. And this is nice because the error that actually occurred is passed to our callback function. So we have it right there. So for instance, this will happen if you try to start the application and the port's already in use. So let's try that out. We've got our application listening on our port right now through nodemon. So let's go to the command line and see what happens when we try to start it again. So here in the command line, if we tried to run nodemon app.js, we get an error here. And this is because we set up our callback to listen for the event of an error and then output the actual error message. In this case, we can just simply see that the error is that the address is already in use. The port 3333 is already in use because we're already listening on that port. So this makes it a lot easier to track down what might have happened and went wrong if there's an error when your server tries to start up. Now, the last thing we're going to do is get rid of this hard-coded port number. And for that, we're going to actually install one more npm module. We can do npm i.env. And what this module does is it allows us to store variables inside of an external environmental variable file that's read in by our application. And this is good for keeping in environment variables that are specific to wherever your application's running. So that can be whether you're running in your test environment or you're running it in whatever remote server the application is deployed to. Having separate .env files to hold all of this information is super valuable. And additionally, in these .env files, you can also have sensitive information that you exclude from source control if you're keeping track of your project that way. And so with this, you can actually call on the .env files values without having to hard code things like database keys, API keys within your application. They can all be stored separately outside of your code. So the first thing that we want to do is create a new file. So Command N for VS Code, and we'll save this as .env inside of the root directory of our project. And we want to only put in one line inside of this file for now. We want to say that, and actually let's change it to port 3000 so we can see that the change is actually taking place. So all this is we're setting up a file that's just going to contain a bunch of variables that are going to be read in by our node application. So in this case, we're just saying that we want the value port to be equal to 3000 in this case. So let's close out this file. And inside of our main application at the very top, it's always good to actually have this set up at the very top so the rest of your application has access to these variables. And I'll show you how in just a second. What we want to do is require the .env module and call the config function off of that module. Now what this is doing is it's requiring the .env module, loading that into the Node app, and immediately calling the config function on that. And all this is going to do is it's going to look in the root directory of our project for a file called .env, which we've already set up. And what it's going to do is load all of those variables inside that file into our process.env object that is just available to all of the code within the Node application. So let's actually use the value that we declared inside of that .env file. So instead of saying port 3333, in here, what we can actually say is process.env and then the value that we declared inside of the environment variable file, our .env file. In this case, it's .port. So we can do that inside of here and inside of here. And now we don't have to hard code a port inside of our application. We can just have it be inside of that .env file. And this is great because what if we want to have in our test environment listen on port 3000, but In our deployment environment, port 3000 is taken up by something else. We want to have it listed on a different port. And so these .env files make it really easy to have separate configurations for different deployment environments. So if we bring up the integrated terminal and start back up NodeMon, we can see that we're now listening on port 3000, which is grabbed from, you guessed it, the .env file. And that concludes things for this tutorial. In the next one, we're going to actually go through and create a bit more scaffolding so we can actually start working with data within the application. So I'll see you then.